Good afternoon in New York, the United States and Canada. Good evening in Africa, Europe, Israel, and the United Kingdom. Good early morning in New Zealand, and welcome whatever time of day or night it is for those joining us from the rest of the world. I'm Yael Danieli, founder and executive director of the International Center for the Study, Prevention, and Treatment of Multigenerational Legacies of Trauma, ICMGLT for short. The ICMGLT is headquartered where the Lenape lived before and during colonization of the Americas. We recognize these indigenous people of Manhattan, their displacement, dispossession, and continued presence. Thank you for joining us on this special day. Today's International Center for Multigenerational Legacies of Trauma webinar is held as observance of Indigenous Peoples Day as an alternative to Columbus Day. Second in a series, participants will discuss the profoundly agonizing inter- and multi-generational legacies of the infamous Indian residential boarding schools and current attempts and past attempts at pursuing mourning, healing, reconciliation, and reparative justice. We held the first webinar in the series on International Day of the World's Indigenous People, which this year followed His Holiness Pope Francis' pilgrimage to apologize to First Nations people in Canada for the church's role in running the Indigenous residential schools in the 19th and 20th century there. Keeping in ICMGLT style, multidisciplinary, multidimensional participants will discuss today this profoundly painful inter-multigenerational legacies of these schools. Before turning to my moderator role, let me acknowledge that this webinar could not have happened without contributions of our board member, Karma Corcoran, our advisory council member and co-chair with Karma of ICMGLT's working group on Indigenous Peoples issues, Mary Fabry, and our advisory council member and old beloved friend, Hereditary Chief Phil Lane, Jr. Thank you, Karma, Mary, and Brother Phil. Your moderator, me, is a clinical psychologist, victimologist, traumatologist, and psychohistorian who has devoted much of my career to studying, treating, and preventing multi-generational impacts of massive trauma, to victims' rights, and to reparative justice. Participants, all of you, thank you for being here. You were all encouraged to watch the film Healing the Hurt on Vimeo prior to the webinar. Produced in 1986 with the late Phil Lucas and available on Vimeo, Healing the Hurt was a primary catalyst that started Canada's residential schools healing process. The film, as you know, documents a ceremonial healing approach to the devastating effects of the Native Canadian and Native American boarding school experiences. Acknowledging the connection between boarding schools abuses and addictions, violence, and other forms of internalized oppression within Indigenous communities, a culturally rooted approach creates a safe space for releasing the pain and starting the healing process. Those of you who watched the documentary have already met our first presenter, Hereditary Chief Phil Lane Jr. Brother Phil is a member of the Ihak Tongwan and Chickasaw nations. Phil, you're going to correct me, please. He began working with indigenous people across the Americas and around Mother Earth in March 1970. He has received numerous international awards for his dedicated service to indigenous peoples in our human family. Chief Lane will reflect on today's implications and lessons learned from Healing the Hurt. Our second presenter, Marsha Small, Blue Tipi woman. Marsha, you will do me the favor and pronounce correctly the tribal names of Northern Cheyenne. Is a cultural... Go ahead, please.
Titista Nasada.
God bless you. Thank you. Marsha is a cultural preservationist, activist, and keeper of knowledge. At 2012, Marsha began using ground penetrating radar to map the unmarked and marked grave sites of Indian boarding school children who died while attending government and church-led Indian boarding schools. Having earned her master's at the Department of Native American Studies at Montana State University, studying the cemetery outside Salem, we all hope that Marsha continues to expand this project to the 23 off-reservation cemetery sites across the United States. Heather Whiteman Ransheim is the director of the Tribal Justice Clinic and an associate clinical professor at James E. Rogers School of Law, University of Arizona in Tucson. Our third presenter, she earlier worked at the Native American Rights Fund in Boulder, Colorado, earned a JD from Harvard Law School, and degrees in fine arts. Heather is a descendant of survivors of the Carlisle Indian School. We have about an hour and a half for the webinar, though we are well known to run a bit over. Each speaker will talk for about 12 minutes. Following an interchange among us, I will open the floor to questions or brief comments from the virtual audience. Panelists will then conclude with last words. Please use the chat function and we'll do our best to respond to as many as we can. Feel free to direct your question to a particular panelist or to the full panel. I give the screen floor to Hereditary Chief and a very dear brother, Phil Lane Jr.
I'd like to extend a very warm and loving handshake and embrace to all members of our human family who have joined us here and will join us over the next weeks as this is shared with our human family. I want to say a prayer to begin this, as we always begin anything with a prayer, especially when we're speaking about something as sacred and as meaningful as what happened in residential schools in Canada and boarding schools here in the United States. Oten Kashal Wakantaka, creator of the universe, most beloved one, all powerful one, most kind one, most compassionate one, ever forgiving one. O ancient of days, O blessed beauty, we call upon your holy power this day. As we especially remember our indigenous peoples of Mother Earth on the Indigenous Peoples Day, but especially remembering all the children, all those who were buried away, hidden away Now here in Canada, up to 10,000, and only 1/3 of our schools have been looked at. And all those that went through this experience, those whose hearts were hurt, those who have committed suicide, those who have died from alcoholism, drug abuse, those who have ended up in prisons, in mental hospitals, and those who have suffered this great, great genocide that occurred across the Americas, including what happened in residential schools, whose purpose was to eliminate, to exterminate the indigenous cultures. And we ask, Creator of all good things, we might remember these things today, on this day of remembrance of indigenous people. We call upon all the tribes and nations of the east, from where comes the red sunrise, to stand in witness of these children, of those who suffered, and these generations since have suffered from this intergenerational trauma that goes back 7 generations and forward 7 generations. May our visit today help to alleviate, help to heal this tremendous genocide that happened. And to Kashtawakantaka, we call upon all the tribes and nations of the South, from where comes new life. They might come together in unity and harmony and witness this and heal these hurts that have occurred. And to the west, from where comes thunder, lightning, and rain, we call upon all those spiritual powers to uplift our hearts and minds, so we might be free of this genocide that happened and come into the fulfillment of our prophecies that promise that across the Americas, the indigenous people are in the process of becoming so enlightened they shall illumine. They becoming so illumined they will enlighten the world, both spiritually and how we look at things. In the Kashtawakantaka, we call upon all the tribes and nations of the north, from where comes the white snow. They come together in unity and harmony, and to witness this day we have, this Indigenous Peoples Day, and this discussion we're going to have regarding what happened to Indigenous people in Canada, the United States, through these church-run, government-run boarding schools. And to Kashtawakantaka, we have thanksgiving to Father Sky. We have thanksgiving to our fathers. We ask, Creator, for forgiveness for the overabundance of masculine qualities that has led us to this place of almost completely destroying our Mother Earth and our human family. We ask that we might fully honor our beloved Mother Earth and the womankind who stand and represent her. And the abuse of women is no different than the abuse of Mother Earth. We ask that humanity wake up to the spiritual reality. The wings of the eagle are 2. The wings of the condor are 2. The wings of the quetzal are 2. One is man and one is woman. Until both wings of that eagle, condor, and quetzal have equal power and respect, the eagle of humanity will never fulfill its highest purpose. So we pray that way. I want to add this prayer for unity that was shared with me in Bolivia more than 50 years ago, as we pray in our vision to unify our human family in war and begin peace on earth by 2030. Oh my God, unite the hearts of thy servants and reveal unto them thy great purpose. May they follow in thy commandments and abide in thy law. Help them, O God, in their endeavor, and grant them strength to serve thee. O God, lead them not to themselves, but guide their steps with the light of knowledge, and cheer their hearts by thy love. Verily thou art their help and their Lord. Hallelujah. Shante washte. Shukmano he meado shinupasapa he meado. Hallelujah. Shante washte. Well, beloved relatives, my experience actually goes back to being born at the Haskell Institute. My mother and father met there when my mother was 13, my dad was 17. And when my father saw my mother, he said, when I saw your mother, son, I said, that's the woman I'm going to marry. And sure enough, 10 years later, after going on to university, he said, because he had to bring some horses. In our tradition, the man brings the dowry. You bring horses, you bring many good things to show that you can take care of your beloved wife. And in fact, the man went and lived with his wife's family because they wanted his wife to be in the most secure place, the place most safe for her or most loving for her, for the children that were to come. And so anyway, he came back 10 years later after we'd been at Haskell together. He'd saved $2,000. He'd gotten a degree. Took him a little extra time because he'd gone to Haskell. and they didn't have quite an academic program, but he came with these gifts. So here's the his horses said, I come to claim what's mine. And so sure enough, that was 1943 as the Navy. 9 months later, my mother had gone to join my grandmother, who took care of the post office, my aunt who worked in the office there at Haskell, and I was born there. And Lawrence, of course, grew up my first 2.5 years on the Haskell campus. So on one hand, I was born in a boarding school. On the other hand, I'm sure I was very loved by all of those children there that had no babies around. From there, you know, my I guess life led me to always go back and visit at home in the Dakotas and also Oklahoma to the Chickasaw Nation. And, you know, I really can understand, you know, to a certain degree as a child of somebody whose parents went to boarding school, because I'll tell you, it was, you know, that impact was pretty tough in terms of how, in fact, I felt like in a way for my young days, I was raised in a boarding school. It was my dad was extremely strict. He didn't want me to associate with anybody in Walla Walla where we were growing up. We lived outside of town. He said, son, I don't want you to lose your wildness. And so I kept out working and so forth. I could only go into town to play sports and so forth. And, you know, my mother, you know, it was very difficult for her to show her feelings. And she was she was a tremendous mother. She took care of our family. I have to say, I never heard my dad swear in front of my mother. At the same time, I know they carried their intergenerational trauma, which does get passed on to us. And so this issue of boarding schools has really been one close to me. And then I moved up here to Canada, first to Blackfoot Confederacy territory, where I took a position as associate professor at the University of Lethbridge in 1980. And it was from that experience, as I began to do healing work and begin to have workshops and so forth, I began to hear the incredible stories of abuse that were taking place at the St. Mary's, St. Paul's residential schools there in the Blood Reserve, as well as when I began to travel into British Columbia, Okanagan, into Shuswap territory, other territories across Canada to the East Coast, begin to hear these horrific stories about what was happening in the boarding school. And so we had made a film called The Honor of All, The Story of Alkali Lake, which really began the sobriety movement here in Canada. I think it was really going well in the United States until gaming came in. It seemed like gaming kind of, you know, stopped the movement I saw happening at that time. To a certain degree, it's still happening. But so we can begin the sobriety movement with the video Healing the Hurts. I mean, with the video The Honor of All, The Story of Alkali Lake. In this process, as we begin to dig into and understand the foundation causes of the alcoholism and drug abuse that were just tremendously impacting our communities. Many of our communities were 100%, 90% completely in alcoholism. I mean, it's like the story of Alkali Lake shares. You know, from 9 years up old, everybody was involved with alcohol, covering up the hurt and pain and shame of these boarding schools. I think to really get an understanding of what happened here, we have to go back and address and at least mention the papal bulls of the 1400s, because these papal bulls gave the permission from the authority of Lord Jesus Christ to take and do what was ever necessary to steal the land or take the land, to enslave the people, anybody who wasn't Christian. They gave this right. And of course, this was picked up and it was used across Africa. From those papal bulls, we find the first ghettos of our Jewish relatives across the Americas, across the Pacific, to Aotearoa, to Hawaii, clear to China, of course, India, Africa. The whole world, in essence, was colonized by, and it's very interesting still today that the those relatives who are European or from European background only represent 9%, 9% of the world's population. That's it. So you can even see in that 9%, and by the way, this is not, I have, along with being an enrolled member of the Yankton Sioux tribe and on the Chickasaw Nation, I have some French, some Irish and English background. So I'm not saying this as a way, I'm just saying that as a human family, we have to understand that during this period of time, this last 500 years, those European nations, those Christian nations, and I can't call them Christian nation, I call it churchianity. What was done in the name of Christianity, from my perspective, has nothing to do with the teachings of Jesus. I call them churchianity. You don't treat people as indigenous people were treated if you're a Christian. And so I want to make that clear, that when I talk about these boarding schools and what happened in these schools, I don't believe it had anything to do with the sacred teachings of Christianity, which has to do with love and compassion, forgiveness, these things. It had to do as a tool for colonization, as a tool that for people that truly believed that if you were not, quote unquote, a Christian, and not only that, their own brand of Christianity, that's what really gets me. I mean, so you had one hand, you had, if you're not a Catholic, you're not going to be saved. If you're not an Anglican, you're not going to be saved. And of course, this began then and led to the doctrine of discovery, that, oh, this is okay. You know, this is manifest destiny. And it is led to all kinds of genocide. Now, I think it's also important to understand that in 1491, and when I was at university with dear sister Lenore Stiffarm and others, Dr. Lenore Stiffarm, it became clear there was around 100 million indigenous people living in the Americas prior to the coming of by the way, in the world's round, this was all part of the process, the predestined arrival of our European relatives in this tremendous struggle we've had to demonstrate that the spiritual power, the spiritual prayers are proving to be stronger than all the materialism and science can put on the table. At the same time, I want to mention this too, that spirituality, religion, without reason, becomes fanaticism. At the same time, science without spirituality becomes a Frankenstein. That really we're finding that we have our indigenous science, it balanced with our spirituality. And so I believe that we're at a time where we're beginning to understand epigenetically, we're at a place where we're understanding that science and spirituality are the wings of the same eagle, just like we know that man and woman are the wings of the same eagle. Anyway, so with these papal bulls, with permission to do whatever you chose to do with the lands and the peoples that were not Christian, that then, of course, led to the fact that since these people were not Christians, we had to do everything we could to ensure they were Christians. And of course, for the High Plains, after the Custer came into land that was never supposed to be entered by treaty. This was supposed to be a sacred land set aside. When he entered there, and our Cheyenne, Arapaho, and of course the Ocheti Chikoan eliminated and probably delivered the U.S. military one of the greatest defeats ever in history. The U.S. Congress passed the Starve or Surrender Act, literally. And from a total of 60 million buffalo that fed the people, it was reduced down to about 1,000. And sure enough, people had to give in, starve or surrender. And at that point, of course, they began to bring in these boarding schools. And their purpose was no less than to kill the Indian, save the child. Duncan Campbell Scott in Canada, who was Minister of Indian Affairs for quite a long time, and who, by the way, Canada looked to the United States for how they're going to have their schools. And for instance, they saw in the United States these large reservations where they would put tribes together they thought would might say, fight each other or whatever. Instead, they became very strong. And so here in Canada, they have put very small reserves, small reservations, not very large compared to what in the US. And then every one of them, they put in a church there. Now, what got me was the idea that these churches came together back in Washington, D.C. And some believed, by the way, that we had a soul. Indigenous people had a soul. Some believed they weren't sure if we had a soul, but it was good just in case to be baptized. And so we began seeing them literally divide up reservations, even though each of these churches believed that theirs was the only way to go to heaven and be with Jesus. And yet they still divided us up. You Catholics, you take this part, Anglicans, you Episcopals, you take this part, and so forth and so on. Now, as well, it became against the law to practice indigenous spirituality. And that's where you have the Freedom of Indian Religion Act. It wasn't legal until about, was it 1978, right in there, where they passed the Freedom of Indian Religion Act. Before that, it was against the law to practice ceremony. In fact, I was just looking at some records where it showed that if you were a mixed blood or half-breed, quote unquote, the way they divide people up, and you went to a sweat lodge ceremony, for instance, not only would you have your rations taken away, you'd be put into jail. If you were a full blood and attended a sweat lodge, you'd be given 10 days without rations. So of course, we had tremendous numbers of indigenous people enter into various churches. And it wasn't because, by the way, all the theology, because most all those relatives didn't speak English. And my father said the reason why, first of all, you could not practice your own spirituality. Secondly, this was a place we found to continue our prayers, to continue our spirituality, because that was the foundation of our cultures, was this incredible connection we had with the Creator in everything we did. And so we just simply did it through the churches. And it wasn't all the theology. It wasn't. I remember someone, when I was there in 1980, I met a wonderful Cree relative. We were talking about this. And he was saying when the Jesuits came to Saskatchewan, they asked to please translate the word sin into the English language, sin. Now, sin is laden with all this stuff about original sin, all this kind of, it's just, that word is in English. So they thought about it for 2 days and 2 nights. They consulted about this one word. And what they came out with, the only thing they could come up with that somehow mirrored the word sin was to shatter your own future. To shatter your own future. That was it. None of the original sin, purgatory, none of this. It was simply that. And so it was a story of this man who had nothing, who rose up spiritually to teach the people, who went and fasted, who stood up for that person that was being stoned, the woman being stoned, and said, let the first person without sins cast the first stone. And so on, that when the sacred things were being abused, he came and threw everybody out of those moneylenders out of the temple. Those kind of stories, the stories they heard, the love, that's what they related to. Because what had happened to us, you can imagine, we utilized everything we had to protect our land, to protect our people. And of course, in the end, we were overrun. We were, not only that, we were massacred. And then to top it off, of course, they realized, okay, the way we're going to do this is we're going to start taking the children away from their parents and sending them to these boarding schools. So you first had, of course, Carlisle Indian School first arrives, a military kind of type boarding school. And they take the children from the leaders, especially leadership of those tribes, and sent them there. Some being away for 10 years from their families. Of course, they did the same there at Haskell. Haskell was a second major Indian boarding school. And then you have Chamawa. You've got many that were set up, others, but those were the two main ones. And you know, in a way, while they, you know, would strip everybody of their indigenous cultures, I can say this at 78 Winters, that what little I've been able to do many times is because my parents went to school with the parents of those relatives I had a chance to work with throughout my life, that we made relationships. So many tribes came together that wouldn't have known each other had that not happened. At the same time, there's no question, along with what happened prior to boarding schools, particularly in the United States, where there was so much violence and massacres and military used, in comparison to Canada, where it was a different type of colonization, just as powerful, but tremendously utilized through the boarding schools, where they'd come into areas where people didn't hardly spoke English yet, and would of course take the children away at 4 and 5 years old, as did happen across the United States, where, you know, you had no choice. But the government, in trying to I want to share something. I think it's really, I just spent time with this group, the Federal Indian Boarding Schools. This group, the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. And they say federal Indian boarding schools were genocide, truth, justice, healing. And of course, this is the group that Deborah Parker, as you know, is part of. And then in the back it says, and this is it. It says it right here, right up front. Genocide, the deliberate killing of a large number of people from a particular nation or ethnic group with the aim of destroying that nation or group.
May I interrupt for 1 minute? Deborah
Sure.
spoke in our previous webinar, and those of you who have not attended it, it's recorded on the website.
Yes.
That was also totally amazing.
Yes, yes. And I had a chance to visit with 3 of Deborah and 2 of her key staff in Nebraska. We had a healing gathering. And, you know, they're really digging in here about what happened here in the United States. The issue, the challenge here, because back when we were working on this issue in Canada, we had a wonderful trial attorney, Sylvia Demarest from down in Dallas, that did a lot of research for us. The challenge we have is the US government has to agree to be sued. And yet we know that the church-run schools are at Marty, South Dakota. We know that there was the abuse that went on there. We know other boarding schools where the abuse happened at Pine Ridge. They're at that still running boarding school. And so they're going to be taking these on, which I think is very important to bring this out so people understand what happened and how it's impacted our indigenous communities. At the same time, you know, I have to tell the story here, and I'll close it off with this. You know, back in about 1980, 1978 through 1980, 82 or 83, I moved up to Canada in 1980. I was invited to go speak at different graduations, like at Rocky Boy and other places, because I was this young guy, had black curly hair. You know,
we can see in the film.
Yeah, in those days in the film, exactly. That was even younger than the film.
Yes.
And so, you know, I'd say all these positive, and I really focus on all the incredible positive contributions our Indigenous peoples, not only here in Turtle Island, but across Abayala, across the Americas. And so I was invited to Rocky Boy to their high school graduation. And so I spoke about how we prayed and how important the Creator was in our lives, and how we treated our elders, how we treated children, how our prophecies told about how we would get through the spiritual wintertime and so forth and so on. and all these good things, the respect for women, all the things, the fact that 80% of every bit of food being eaten upon Mother Earth today was domesticated here in the Americas. And it's kind of interesting to me of how it was the food that came from the Americas that was able to really accelerate the growth in Europe. It was the gold and silver taken from the Americas that was enabled Europe to move from a barter system to a currency system. So many contributions came from us here in the Americas, and we lived here really in relative peace and harmony. And so anyway, I shared all those things. I looked out, I could see the elders were happy. I could see the parents were happy. I see some of the students, at least they weren't totally bored. And then some were really listening. But I saw this one young man. I could tell this did not resonate with him. There was a question he had, I could tell. And I knew he'd come and ask me the question. So of course, as it is, wherever you have an Indigenous gathering, I think it's same as other cultures. You got to eat. You got to eat together. So sure enough, that evening we had some great food to eat, and I went up to get some food, and here comes this young man. So I knew he was going to come to ask me a question. And so he came and said, Phil, he said, I heard all these wonderful things you said about our Indigenous people, how we loved our Creator, how we tried to live in integrity, how we treated our elders and young people, how we went out to Sundance and to fast in order to connect ourselves deeper with the Creator and so forth. He went on, he was able to how we domesticated all this food because we live here in relative peace and harmony compared to the rest of the world, all those things. Then he says, I have one question to ask you, Phil. I said, what is that? Why did God punish us? Just like that. Why did God punish us? Well, that's a pretty good question. And so I had been around many elders by that time, and I knew enough to say, well, let me pray about this. A really good question. And I did want to pray about it because it was a meaningful question. And so it so happened that I was going up to Bear Butte to fast and getting ready to Sundance there at Standing Rock, Little Eagle. So I went up and I prayed there, and I began to really think about this when I was fasting and praying about what that young man asked me. And I realized, I began to see, okay, yes, we had a very, very hot sweat, came up here, we're sitting up here with no food and water, praying, and your lips get thick, your tongue gets thick, your lips crack. Here you are, yet you still continue to pray. You're still reaching out for the Creator. All through that test, you might say, that you've entered into, that spiritual process of going deeper into your spirituality. And you keep praying and go through how many days that you stay, 3, 4, 2, whatever, without food and water, you come back and sweat. And when you get to come through that whole experience, you leave that last sweat, when you're done, you feel stronger, you feel better. So I thought, I thought about that. Then, of course, we went and Sundanced, and this elder, Pete Ketches, liked to dance 2 days and 2 nights, nonstop. We call them 2 blue days, 2 yellow days. And it was during that process, Pete was kind of coaching us there on different things. It was during that process, I remember when we finished and we had some chokecherry juice and various things to begin breaking our fast. It came to me. I felt so good after that. Then it came to me. We just finished a 500-year Sundance. We're emerging stronger and more united than ever before. Indigenous people are rising everywhere across the Americas. We've now connected. There's now, we went down from over 100 million down to about 20 million. That's the genocide. Now we're back to 80 million. Of those 80 million, very interesting, only 8 million live north of the US border in Canada, the United States. 72 million live south of the US border. We're the youngest population in the Americas and one of the youngest in the world, and we're the fastest growing. And we've been able to connect in a way, an embryonic way, but connect all the social networks of indigenous people in Spanish, English, and Portuguese across the Americas. And now we're working to build the first digital nation across the Americas because we share common values. You know, it's really interesting. You can go wherever you want to go in the Americas and you'll find the same kind of like framework in essence, respect to the creator, respect to the four directions, respect to our Mother Earth and Father Sky and the four directions and our creator. You find that everywhere. That same, now it's different, difference in songs, difference in different things, there's different ceremonies, but by and large, I would say in my journeys that began back in Bolivia in 1970 in March, and I actually began my journey back in 1967 in March, I've found wherever I've traveled, whether it be Ecuador, Bolivia, Peru, Brazil, Panama, wherever it's been, Mexico, where you have the largest number of indigenous people in terms of within a colonial nation state, over 14 million indigenous people who still speak their language, still speak the point. So I guess what I'm saying is that yes, we've gone through these boarding schools. Yes, they were horrific. I mean, I work with thousands of survivors in this whole thing that happened here in Canada, thousands. I mean, I heard the stories of a little girl downstairs in the basement in the bakery where they had the furnace, bringing a child impregnated by a priest, little baby, dressed her all up and threw her in the furnace, and having her hear the sound, ee! You know, the things that were done, electrical shock, putting in children in electric chairs, you know, having people eat their vomit, beating children in front of other children, and shaming them. You know, of course, children who are scared to death, of course they're going to wet the bed, and having them walk around with those sheets of urine wrapped around them and come in and among all the children, shaming them. You know, the sexual abuse that took place, and then the encouraging of those that were sexually abused. Particularly, I can think of one school at St. Mary's in the Blood Reserve where this Jerry Dawson, they even had a whole gymnasium complex honoring the Jerry Dawson Athletic Center, when inside we later found out he was sexually abusing the boys, and he had the older boys, he sexually abused the younger boys. The same thing happened to the girls, not just in the Catholic churches, the Episcopal, the United Church of God, the United Church of Christ. So these things happened, and we're healing. We're healing, and I'm going to say that Deborah and her group, I really wish them well as finding these graves. We went to Haskell, for instance, and we'd be happy to share this with you. We went and made offerings on every single grave and recorded digitally every single relative who's there at Haskell. We prayed, offered tobacco, smudged that grave. I started going back there many years ago.
Dear Brother Phil, would we now indeed let Marcia present her work on the graves?
Yes, exactly. Perfect.
Like many others, I can listen to you for days and days.
You better slow me down. You better slow me down, because I can go on for a while.
It is precious. It is precious for all of us.
Okay, that's. I love you, sister, and I can't wait to hear from our sisters.
Exactly.
Okay.
Heather, Marcia raised the question whether justice is possible after all this. Please, the floor is yours. And Heather was, of course, absolutely right in the chat, saying that this must be triggering so much for everyone in all these, in our chat room, in our panel room.
Okay,
And
ready?
yes, we are ready.
And I've been trying to somehow put a link to the resources for trauma self-care.
Yes,
And I don't know if that's been made available to the viewers of your webinar. I think the chat just went out to the panelists and the hosts.
yes, of course, it's immediately available. Yes,
Great,
thank you.
great. Okay, thanks.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I wanted to thank Chief Lane for the prayer to open this discussion. And also thank you, Marcia, for sharing the insights and the really important work that you've been doing on this issue to begin to finally shed some real light and bring to light what needs to happen and what we're really dealing with here. So my name is Heather Whiteman Runsham. I'm a citizen of the Crow Nation in Montana. I'm presenting to you today from my place of work at the University of Arizona, which is on the traditional homelands of the Tohono O'odham people and the Pasquayaki people, as well as many other indigenous stewards of the land over the millennia. I'm a descendant of survivors of the Carlisle Indian School. My great grandparents, Charles Dillon and Rosa LaForge Dillon, met at Carlisle Indian School and were actually married there. So for my family, we have very, I guess, very mixed emotions about the legacy of the boarding schools, because that's where our ancestors came to be joined as a married couple and as the parents who produced a number of children who went on to become our grandparents and then our parents and ourselves and then our children. Even as that is, we know that our great grandparents had a very difficult existence during their time at the boarding school. I've been really appreciative of the digitization of a lot of the records that makes it more available to people across the world to figure out, the stories of our ancestors, because many of them didn't live to share a lot about their experience, and many of them weren't able to share, even if they lived to do so. So being able to look at the records that exist and put together the pieces to understand some of the things that we deal with today in our families and in our communities. Of course, my grandparents survived Carlisle as a married couple. They moved back to the Crow Reservation. My great-grandfather was actually from the Crow Creek Sioux tribe in South Dakota, married a Crow woman, and then moved to the Crow Reservation for the rest of his life, which unfortunately wasn't terribly long. Although my grandparents survived and had children together, they did not live to a ripe old age. They were both fairly unhealthy and died at a young age and left young children behind. They both had tuberculosis and did not survive into old age. And that's had a lasting impact on our family. And I think a lot of people have similar stories and similar experiences with what the impact of boarding schools and the long-term health, physical health problems resulting from those ancestors that attended, as well as the mental health challenges. A lot of us continue to deal with those to this day. So, we've talked a lot about in our communities for a long time about trying to figure out remedies for these issues. And people have certainly gone to court and haven't found a lot of success in litigating these questions. Unfortunately, the courts in the United States especially are very structured to prevent meaningful avenues towards justice for people, for individuals that are impacted by these types of historical events. There are a lot of barriers in the court system that have prevented individuals, indigenous individuals, or indigenous communities and nations from being able to find redress for the many, many wrongs that have happened to them through these policies. So a number of years ago, the Native American Rights Fund, along with a coalition of other groups, had a series of gatherings of Native Americans to talk about what needed to happen with respect to the boarding school policy. What would reconciliation look like? What processes have been explored in other parts of the world, especially, in places like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, where the policies were very closely mirrored to what we experienced here in the United States. And what do we see as the needs in our communities, right? And every Indigenous nation is going to have a different nuanced response to that. What do you need to heal, right? We can certainly identify a lot of commonalities in the impacts we see, but as far as what would best serve our communities, there's certainly not one monolithic answer and position coming from Indigenous peoples throughout North America. But in order to empower each of our nations to determine those questions for themselves, we need to have access to information. We need to understand what really happened so that we can address it on our own terms in the way that we believe will be most appropriate and effective. But the truth has been evasive, right? We haven't been able to get the United States to account for, and for a long time, even to acknowledge that this policy existed and its harmful impacts that continue to impact us to this day. In 2016, NARF, along with its coalition, filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Bureau of Indian Education. This FOIA request included just the very basic of questions. How many children attended these schools? How many schools were operated? How many children died while they were registered in the custody of the United States attending these schools? And for those children that died, where are they? Right? Where were they buried? Were they sent home? Were their communities and families notified of their fate? Just, the very basic expectations of beginning to uncover, what needs to be atoned for, what needs to be addressed. The federal government responded informally that this FOIA request was not one that could be answered. It was too broad and it involved records from many different locations. And furthermore, it is not the job of the federal government to do our research for us. So that was the informal response. We never received a formal response to the FOIA request. In 2017, the Bureau of Indian Affairs informed a reporter that our request had been closed, although we had never received any notification of that. In April 2019, we filed a submission with the UN Working Group on Enforced and Involuntary Disappearances because we had not been able to receive any formal response to our FOIA request, and because the responses that we had received were so unsatisfactory and really unresponsive. So we filed our submission to the UN Working Group, and in May of 2019, a month later, a group of us, 4 women, went to Geneva to present our submission. So we had with us the executive director of the Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, Eleanor Hayden, who is a descendant of a Carlisle Indian school survivor whose sister, her mother's sister, remains unaccounted for. She was at Carlisle. She never returned home, and her family has never been provided with information as to her final resting place or what or where she went. And finally, Marcia Small, who we just heard from, who talked about, the research that she's been doing and the ramifications of every indicator she's been able to find of the scope of this issue, the incredible challenge that lies ahead for Native nations in accessing the truth and having full and complete information on what happened to their children that were taken to boarding schools by the United States government. We identified the UN Working Group on Enforced and Involuntary Disappearances because of their mandate. This was a UN entity whose mandate was established by the Human Rights Council in 1980. The mandate is to accept submissions for individual cases as well as general allegations regarding member states, and to engage with the member states to resolve disappearances. Of course, many of the all of the cases involved in our submission predated the establishment of this mandate. However, it's important to understand that a disappearance is an ongoing wrong. Whether somebody disappeared in 1922 or 2022, that is an ongoing wrong that continues and brings it within the scope of the mandate of the UN Working Group on Enforced and Involuntary Disappearances. The focus of the mandate is on the right to truth of individuals, families, and communities, and that would include Indigenous nations. It's a 5-member body. The chair at the time of our submission was Bernard Duhaime from Canada, who had done some significant work on boarding and residential schools and was very familiar with the history and the issues. And I think that was another thing that we thought was favorable in bringing our submission to this working group. The working group holds 3 annual meetings and reports annually to the Human Rights Council on the reports that it has received, the submissions it has received, and its determination of whether they fall within its mandate. So a couple of things that I think are just important to note and helpful. The UN Declaration on the Rights of All Persons to be Free from Enforced and Involuntary Disappearances was passed in 1993. And that talks about what an enforced disappearance is. And I won't read you the entirety of the text here, it's in the slide, but it's clear that our history with Indian boarding schools, our children fall within the scope of the UN Declaration on the Rights of All Persons to be Free from Enforced and Involuntary Disappearances. Furthermore, the International Covenant then for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances, adopted in 2006 and coming into force in December 2010, fully incorporates the UN Declaration on Rights to be Free from Enforced and Involuntary Disappearances into an international binding treaty or convention. 57 states have ratified or acceded to that convention. The United States has not to date. The UN Working Group has further provided a couple of comments that I think are supportive of our issue here. Commenting on the right to truth, the working group stated, the right to the truth in relation to enforced disappearances means the right to know about progress and results of an investigation, the fate or whereabouts of disappeared persons, and the circumstances of the disappearances and the identity of the perpetrators. And the comment on ongoing nature of disappearances also shows and demonstrates that our issue, our history here falls within the scope of the mandate of this UN Working Group. So our submission to the UN Working Group was a joint submission from the Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, International Indian Treaty Council, National Indian Child Welfare Association, Native American Rights Fund, the Saginaw Chippewa tribe, the Rosebud Sioux tribe, and several individuals. It included a list of at least a dozen children whose fate could not be ascertained by reviewing records in archives from 3 selected schools. That research was performed by an independent researcher funded through the Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, Preston McBride. We also cited to the ground penetrating radar and magnetometry performed by Marcia Small at Chemawa Indian School that again shows that there are many unmarked graves and burials of multiple individuals in graves that, you know, really lead us to believe that this is a very large problem. There could be potentially thousands of children in these cemeteries who are not identified and whose families and tribes may be out there continuing to wonder what happened to them. They've never been notified of the death of this individual, this relative, or where their final resting place is. We included in our submission Eleanor Hayden's aunt, Mary Kennenook, who attended Carlisle and never returned home, and whose family has still not been given information on the site of her interment. And Eleanor was one of the individual signatories to our submission. The UN Working Group responded favorably to our submission. They took it on as a general allegation rather than an individual case, although we did include information that would have supported them taking it on as an individual case, probably solely on behalf of Eleanor and her family. But they treated it as a general allegation and included our submission in their post-sessional document, including that in 2019 with their draft report, which was received favorably by the Human Rights Council in September of 2019. In 2020, the report included an update regarding the Human Rights Council, or a report to the Human Rights Council updating that there had been no response from the United States about our general allegation regarding the boarding school children. So that was in 2020. Considering the administration at the time and their level of engagement with the United Nations and Human Rights Council, that wasn't incredibly surprising. A week after the 2019 inclusion of our report, the inclusion of our submission in the UN Working Group's report to the Human Rights Council, we received a letter from the Bureau of Indian Affairs to Native American Rights Fund regarding the FOIA request, basically saying, oh, hey, we thought this was closed. You guys still interested? And we responded, of course, in writing to that inquiry and said, we don't consider this closed. We still are interested in a response to our FOIA request. We said that within the deadline, the timeframe provided in the BIA letter, and we hadn't heard anything further since that time. Apart from that process, the United States, of course, had a change in administration and finally did respond to the UN Working Group's outreach in fall of 2021, just close to a year ago now. In its response to the UN Working Group, the United States cited to the funding of programs and intentions to compile information, consult with tribal nations, and report on the boarding school issue. That report was ongoing at the time of the United States response. And of course, in May of 2022, the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative investigative report was issued through the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs, Brian Newland's office. Of course, along with all of this, we can't neglect to mention Secretary of Interior, Deborah Haaland, who has made this a priority issue for her administration. And so the traction that we've gained in seeing this issue getting some attention, getting some dedication of resources is really noteworthy. So hopefully it's a trend that continues. I think it's a beginning that a beginning of an effort that is going to be much longer term. The 2022 report noted, I think significantly, that there had long been inconsistent federal reporting of child deaths, including the number and cause of circumstances of death and burial sites, specifically in the context of talking about unmarked and unknown graves and unrecorded grave sites. As it was issued, the report was widely characterized as being volume 1, and that there was more to come with respect to the federal response to these issues, these questions, and that there were obviously additional questions that remain outstanding that will hopefully be responded to in the near future. Along with the report, there's the effort to get legislation in place to establish a process by, federal law, establish a commission to begin to deal with these issues, to empower a group of individuals to oversee that. And that's what we currently have in HR 5444, a bill to establish the Truth and Healing Commission on Indian boarding school policies in the United States and for other purposes. The draft legislation, of course, is in the House. It's awaiting a hearing, and we hope that folks will, do outreach, reach out to your lawmakers, your senators, your Congress people most immediately, and encourage them to be supportive of the bill and moving it forward, and to not compromising the draft bill in ways that will make it less meaningful. It's really important to have a strong bill that will provide a process that, Indian people, Indian country will have faith in and will see as something meaningful rather than.
Heather, sorry for interruption. Do you know when the bill is coming up?
It's been introduced.
Right.
It's in the House. It's waiting for a hearing, from what I understand.
Okay, so you will keep us informed so we can let everyone know.
Sure. Yeah. And, again, I think we always come back to Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, who have done just a tremendous job of, promoting the bill, keeping people updated on its progress and giving folks some pointers for how to support the bill and what you can do. So you can look to NABS's website. There's a toolkit on there for advocacy if you want to engage in that. There's a lot of information about what the bill is intended to do. A lot more detail than I can probably go into today with the time we have, but it's an important piece of legislation that would begin to give us some concrete structure to deal with these issues.
But if you send us the information, it will be on our.
Okay, well, if I had a way to put something in the chat that would go out to everybody, I'd happily do that.
Fantastic, wonderful.
Because when I go into chat, it just goes to the host and panelists. It doesn't go to everybody. Okay, so I just included here at the end a picture, and following up on our submission, we continue to go back to Geneva a couple of times to raise awareness about our submission among other Indigenous advocates who work within the UN Human Rights Council system and the mandates under the Human Rights Council. We presented a side event during the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples session in July 2019. And we invited to present with us representatives from Indigenous nations in Australia and Canada to talk about their experiences as boarding school and residential school students, survivors, and what their national legal framework has looked like for addressing those issues in their context. And we found that those discussions were incredibly helpful and healing in a lot of ways, because when we hear that we're not alone, that our experiences are sadly, consistent with what other people have experienced, it helps us understand that we are reacting in ways that are to be expected, and that it's reasonable for us to need what we need, right? And that there are legal barriers here in the United States that folks haven't had in other places. So it gives us hope that maybe there is a way forward, a path forward, if our laws and our legal system is amenable to doing that. So it means that we have a lot of work to do, but I think it also sheds light on potential paths forward that, are obviously not easy, obviously not straightforward, but do exist. And with that, I just wanted to say thank you, including here a picture of young women from my tribe at a boarding school on our reservation, and the young woman in the front row at the far right is my great-grandmother before she went to Carlisle. She was at our on-reservation boarding school before. But, so yeah, if folks are interested in getting more information about our submission, if you're interested in joining the submission in the event that we move forward and amend it or try to renew it in the event that the United States stalls again in its progress in access to information and truth, we'd be interested in having additional partners. If you're relative to somebody who has remained unaccounted for, whose fate and final resting place is unknown, we would really appreciate being able to talk about how ways we could potentially support each other. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Heather. You brought some hope despite all this, the report of struggle. The center is a potential partner, there's no question about it. Also, in our library, there is a special section called Victims' Rights, Rights of Future Generations, and Reparative Justice, that contains much of the available known materials in international law to support this. We will indeed add your stuff to it, but also please feel free to go there and let's remain in a dialogue what should be added and what can help you. Many of us, including myself, spend our whole careers creating in international law all the instruments on behalf of victims' rights and optimal care. So may I use my position to say, yeah, we are with you. And that's why we have this webinar as well. That was a brilliant presentation. God bless you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Daniele. And I appreciate the invitation to be here and speak. And unfortunately, I have a scheduled event that I'm already a little bit late for, so I'm going to have to leave before the Q&A, but I look forward to talking more with you in the future. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Heather. Very, very great work you're doing.
We love you guys. We do have, do we have questions and answers? And I know that today, because it is a special day, you have to go elsewhere to attend also other events. We all do our best to try to both honor the day, but also understand it's a delicate balance. I hope everyone in the audience also understands that. We have, we promised an interchange among us next. I wonder very briefly if you want to, or you want to postpone it to last words and first attend to the audience that has been so attentive. It's up to you guys. Marsha, what do you think?
What are you requesting? You want to do it later? I do have to, I got Indigenous Peoples Day here, so
We have Indigenous people here too, yes.
I'm helping run the show here, so gotta go.
I know, because you were one of the people in your state who got the special day acknowledged. So we take our hat off to you. Thank you. There are only 21 states in the United States who are acknowledging this, for the audience to know.
Do you know if there's any other cities in the United States states that actually pay for the holiday as Indigenous Peoples Day?
I know Boston is extremely
Just
active.
Bozeman, I think, is the only one. That's the only one I can find so far. But it's an official holiday here. It's Indigenous Peoples Day. It's a paid holiday on the day of, and it's official, and I just think that's fabulous. So
I'm sure there's more. Why won't all of us look around, and that would be a nice piece of information to put on our website too, to inform people.
Marcia, I want to thank you so much for your dedicated work, and I want to remember relatives there at Northern Cheyenne that had such an impact on my life. I used to go down and sweat with Tommy Rock Rhodes. I don't know if Tommy's still around, but Tommy and I used to go. He lived up there, and we'd go and sweat and get in that water. Ralph Red Fox was a janitor there at the school, and we really hit it off. I went there, and we're back in the late 70s, early 80s, no, late 70s, doing workshops on curriculum development there at Busby and so forth. And Austin Two Moons was another great influence in my life. So you come from a great nation, and it's so interesting that, you know, even though the Cheyenne and the Dakota Lakota languages are different, that we were allies, have been allies all these years in the fight against Custer. All along we've been allies to the Cheyenne. So I just want to thank you for the great work you're doing. We're at it here in Canada. We're up to 10,000 now, 10,000 children. By the way, they didn't even pretend there. They didn't even give them gravestones. They just hit them. They just disappeared. And by the way, I'll send you along, if you'd like, to all the work we did there at Haskell. We have all the names. We made offerings and prayers. I'll send those videos along to you, so you have that. But great. Thank you so much.
You send it to the center as well, of course.
Will do.
Right. Phil, there is a question directed especially to you. Do you feel you were told right when you were told to not lose your wellness? how do you interpret this message? Victoria King is asking this.
To our sister Marcia.
This is to you.
Oh, to me.
Yes.
And I'll repeat the question.
Okay, she's saying, do you feel you were told right when you were told to not lose your wellness? And how do you interpret this message?
Oh, not to lose my wildness, my dad told me. 100%. You know, I think that, first of all, I want to say this, it's so important. There are many members of our human family who are stepping forward to help us. We cannot forget that. We can't forget that every human being upon this Mother Earth is a child of Mother Earth, is an Indigenous person, therefore has a responsibility to take care of our mother. And I think we also have to remember that only hurt people, only abused people, only colonized people. It's so important, remember this. At the same time, that does not take away from the fact that justice must be done. But in terms of, no, I think that I'm glad that I kept my wildness to a certain degree. I mean, you know, and now, in terms of now, it's more of a spiritual wellness. But in my young days, I gotta say that, you know, I was full of hatred. I was full of anger. I was full of rage. I hated myself for having European background. I hated myself. I hated those who that I knew. I was a vociferous reader. I know what happened to my parents in boarding schools. I know what happened to my other parents, and I was full of anger and rage. I understand that part. It took me so far in athletics. I'll tell you what, in every wrestling match I went in, across me was General George Armstrong Custer, and I tried to hurt my opponents, hurt them. In football, every single time I fought, was the 7th Cavalry, and I wanted to hurt those relatives. I only had to wrestle twice against Indigenous people, Sonny Six Killer, or Vernon Six Killer from Yakima, and Joe Hoptowit from Yakima. I just couldn't get into it. But that then took me to alcohol, drugs, unhealthy relationships, because you can't be full of hatred and anger. So forgiveness, as difficult as it is, and I think the number one thing from my perspective, holding us back as Indigenous people is our own disunity caused by colonization. We have been able to do tremendous things, even in the conditions we are. But I can see it happening, our 7th generation's rising, but in unity, in diversity, like we said, we have to respect everybody's perspective, but we can come together. I remember my uncle Vine Deloria, who had a lot of influence on me, whom my direct relative said to me, he said, you know, in the future, when we come together in unity, our Indigenous people can have tremendous influence on elections, for instance, small numbers. So we are growing, we're getting stronger, and through the work of Marcia's going back and remembering, we never forget our children. We never, and that's what she's doing. Doesn't make any difference if they're passed 100 years ago. We take care, like I'm sure many other members of our human family. So I just wanted to and also one other thing, I think real clear, you know, when the Pope came to Canada, people need to understand that the U.S. the government of Canada paid the Pope $25 million. $25 million to come here. It seems like after what happened, the Pope should have come here with a big donation rather than taking $25 million from the government of Canada to come. Now, during that time, because of tremendous outflow of emotions and feelings, finally, after 3 days, the Pope did admit this was genocide. So just wanted to share that much. I know we're over time, and again, our thanks to Heather, Marcia.
Marcia, are you still with us? I could see that you find Brother Phil's comment.
Yeah, I've got to leave. I've got like.
I know, but not to listen to him. It's like it's so much comfort to lose.
Absolutely, and I appreciate it.
Don't leave yet, because there is a lot of people are requesting the PowerPoints. I'm not sure whether they're referring to you. or
I prefer not to share my PowerPoint. I'm still doing a dissertation, good people. I share with you my data, my current data, but I'm still doing a dissertation. And in that PowerPoint is some slides that I'm going to have in my dissertation.
Oh, you mean, so you want to hold it for you?
If that's okay with you all.
Oh, of course.
Well, okay. And you will, but
And then
you
it makes it
will-
more powerful that you have to be here to learn,
Yes.
you know. I really have to go, good people.
Okay.
It's such an honor to be with
Love
you all.
you. Love you, sister.
we love
Hang
you.
in there. Hang in there.
We will
Enjoy.
see you soon
Thank you
again.
so much.
Asha, thank
You
you.
take care. All right.
Thank you, dear.
Happy
I love-
IPD Day.
Thank you so much for being here. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. But there's another question then for you from
Yes.
Elena Buffalo Spirit. Thomas Ruckrose is still living in Busby, Montana.
Oh, whoa, good. I'm gonna have to
It's
find a
not
way
a
to reach out. Please, if you would, I'll have to check how I can get a phone call because we haven't talked for years.
Elena, if you can send either Phil or me, he will get it immediately from me. If you
I
can
would love to
send us
talk to Tommy and
his
see how he's
phone
doing.
number so Phil can contact him. Phil is on our advisory council, so it's like he's totally involved. And Larry Holman, thank you for putting up in the question and answer section the 5444 information, so everybody who is interested can use that. Thank you. Everybody was running, I understand,
Yes.
but Phil, there are two things I want to still bring up. One is today I learned that within 30 days, there will be a hearing on the adoption, the bill on the adoption of children and the forced adoption of children. So we should discuss that and perhaps have a webinar on that too quickly. And I will be in touch with the ACLU person who wrote me. And Karma, if you're still here, and Mary, please, let's have a meeting immediately in order to discuss this. Thank you, everyone,
Yes.
so much for being with us. This is a second in a series. We'll have many more. I promise. We are committed in the long run. And I look forward to hearing from all of you and remaining available in our center to everyone. Phil, I wonder if you have a last word, sorry, to share with people.
I would say this. I want to thank all those relatives,
Yes.
my dear sister Angela and others that came to listen, and I know to support the healing of our human family. I think that it's time that we really know that we have to come together to understand that we are one human family, that we need to give one another support as we move forward to these very challenging, it's almost like in a collective way, we're within the birth canal as I see it. And that time is a very intense, very intense time. And our human family is going through that. And it's going to deepen. And it's going to be our choice. Do we come together and understand we're one human family, and the hurt of one is the hurt of all, including all our animal relatives, the plant relatives, the water, our earth, we're one. And I truly believe without question that we're awakening. It's so important. An awakening and forgiving ourselves, forgiveness for ourselves, for anything we feel, of all the hurt and shame that comes through these boarding schools, that comes through colonization, which comes through what we've all been through as a human family. We've got to shed and get rid of that, and to come together truly, truly understanding that we can together transform this world we live in. We have that capacity. It's our choice, and we can fulfill all the sacred promises that promise without question the emergence of a whole new global civilization based in justice, where the wisdom, where the insights of Indigenous people will be heard and will be listened to, as well as the justice of oneness, for the equality of women and men, for the balancing of extremes of wealth and poverty, for so many things that seem are becoming clearer and clearer that are needed, especially the healing of intergenerational trauma. And as I've said before, no consumption, no cartels. One of the things we have to look at is why is this happening throughout the Western world? All this death from overdoses, etc. And so instead we have a war on drugs fighting the cartels in Mexico, and the issue's right here. The issue's right here in the United States, in Canada, in other countries that are consuming all these drugs. Why? We need to get down to that. And especially looking at our Indigenous communities, we know where it's coming from, the intergenerational trauma, which we're losing so many young people to overdoses, to suicide, as other members of our human family. So I think I would say this, my dear beloved sister, Yael, that's a question. Why? Why is that happening? No consumption, no cartels. This war on drugs, I think, is focused in the wrong direction. We have to look here inside our own souls and hearts. What is going on? Why are these young people committing suicide? Why are these young people overdosing and taking drugs in the first place? They know that can kill them because they're in such pain. And why is this society filled of so much pain, so much disunity? That's a big question I think we have to answer. And we are answering, I hope.
We love you, dear.
Love you, sweetie.
Okay, see you soon.
Later.
See you soon.
All
Thank
right.
you, everyone who is still here.
Yes.
We so respect your commitment and your own, loving attendance. And we wait for more. We promise more. Thank you so much.